the fading light of August 2nd, 2011, a young mother pulled up to her house on a quiet street just outside Paraguay's capital. In the back seat, her 6-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old boy chatted softly after an ordinary day. They barely noticed when a man on a motorcycle pulled up to the driver's window, raised a handgun, and without a word, fired a single shot into the woman's head, painting the interior with blood. When investigators finally uncovered who was responsible, the truth would be almost impossible to believe. Evelyn Michelle Eberhardt was born in 1988 and grew up in a respectable family in suburban Paraguay. By 2011, at 23, she was a young mother devoted to her little daughter. Friends and relatives would later describe Evelyn as caring and hopeful, a woman who had her whole life ahead of her. She lived in Fernando de la Mora, a bustling district of about 160,000 people just outside Asunción, where tidy residential streets mix with small businesses and workshops. Paraguay is a country of strong family ties, and Evelyn's family was no exception. She was the youngest daughter of the Eberhardt family, and particularly close to her mother, Frida Eberhardt. Evelyn also had an older sister, Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt, who was 10 years her senior. The Eberhardts were of partly European descent, and they were well known in their community. Evelyn's father had passed away years earlier, but under her mother Frida's guidance, the family remained close-knit. They shared Sunday meals and attended church together. As the investigation into Evelyn's murder began, police detectives canvassed the area. Eyewitness accounts were scarce. The killer had struck with swift precision and disappeared. Evelyn's 6-year-old daughter was in shock and only able to describe a man on a motorcycle with a helmet. A neighbor thought they saw the bike speeding off toward the main road. No one got a clear look at the shooter's face. Still, detectives noted an unusual clue. According to the children and one passerby, the assailant had been wearing what looked like a dark police-issue jacket. That detail set off alarm bells. If the killer was impersonating a police officer, or worse, was a police officer, it pointed to a planned assassination. By the next morning, Paraguayan news outlets had picked up the story of the murder in Fernando de la Mora. A young mother executed in front of her child. It led newscasts and newspapers. And soon, another detail emerged. Evelyn was killed by a single bullet through her left eye, a macabre detail leaked from the coroner's report. That tidbit riveted the public and investigators alike. A shot to the head, especially through the eye, suggested an experienced gunman aiming to ensure instant death. It was the kind of ruthless efficiency seen in sicariato killings that plague parts of Latin America. But who would hire a hitman to kill Evelyn? In those first days, police looked at obvious angles. They learned that Evelyn had recently been in a romantic relationship. In fact, a secret relationship that only a few people knew of. Shockingly, the man was Jorge Daniel Centurion, who happened to be Evelyn's brother-in-law, or rather, her sister Marilyn's ex-husband. This revelation complicated the narrative of Evelyn's life. Jorge Centurion was a businessman who had been married to Marilyn Eberhardt for several years. After Marilyn and Jorge separated in 2010, he had begun seeing Evelyn on the side. It was an illicit romance that both Evelyn and Jorge kept under wraps, likely knowing how explosive it could be if it came to light. Evelyn had been only 22 when she started seeing the 35-year-old Jorge, and as family friends would later whisper, she seemed genuinely in love. But such a relationship was bound to provoke gossip and fury. Investigators quickly discovered that Marilyn had been aware of the affair and was deeply upset by it. Marilyn, at 33, was a successful businesswoman in her own right. She and Jorge had owned an auto body workshop together during their marriage. In fact, at one point, Marilyn had even hired her younger sister Evelyn to work at that auto shop. The arrangement did not end well. After Marilyn's marriage with Jorge fell apart, Marilyn took over the workshop herself, and she fired Evelyn from the job in the process. Family acquaintances recalled tension between the sisters over that incident. Still, no one imagined it could lead to violence. They were, after all, family. But as detectives dug deeper, a troubling picture came into focus. According to witnesses who later spoke in court, jealousy, rivalry, and money were entangled in the sisters' relationship. Marilyn was the elder, accustomed to being the successful, responsible one. Evelyn was the baby of the family, pretty and outgoing. When Evelyn took up with Jorge, Marilyn's ex-husband, Marilyn was reportedly incensed. It wasn't only wounded pride at stake. Jorge Centurion owned several businesses. Marilyn, who had no children of her own at the time, feared that if Evelyn and Jorge's relationship solidified, her younger sister might claim a share of those assets, or inherit what Marilyn saw as rightfully hers. In the eyes of some relatives, Marilyn became blinded by jealousy and began to see Evelyn as a threat that needed to be eliminated. In July 2011, just weeks before the murder, phone records later showed a sudden uptick in communication between Marilyn and a young man named Guillermo Escobar Cortázar. Escobar, 25 years old, worked as an auto mechanic. He was actually Marilyn's employee at her auto workshop, someone she trusted. Investigators would discover that around late June or early July, Marilyn had approached Guillermo Escobar with a horrifying request. She wanted help to get rid of her own sister. In essence, Marilyn was recruiting him to find a hitman. Initially, Escobar later admitted he was taken aback that she would go to such lengths. But Marilyn was persistent and insistent. She was not asking him to do it himself. She knew Guillermo had contacts, friends from the neighborhood and beyond. Marilyn offered money, a lot of money, for the job. And Guillermo, who was young and perhaps eager to win favor and a reward from his boss, agreed to help find a killer for hire. Guillermo Escobar turned to a friend of his, a man he played football with on weekends. That friend was Officer Emigdio Ismael Gonzalez Segovia, a 28-year-old policeman serving in the 19th Metropolitan Police Station in Asunción. Emigdio was an active-duty police officer, sworn to uphold the law, but according to Escobar's later testimony, he was also in dire financial straits. When Escobar quietly inquired whether Emigdio would be interested in a job to kill a girl, the policeman did not hesitate. The offer on the table was 40 million Guaraníes, roughly $9,000 at the time, to murder Evelyn Eberhardt. For context, $9,000 is a significant sum in Paraguay, more than many police officers' annual salary. Emigdio Gonzalez agreed almost immediately, allegedly saying he would do it, no problem at all. The casualness of his response would later horrify the court. A sworn officer so readily agreeing to betray every principle of his duty for a pile of cash. Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt thus set a deadly plan in motion. She provided Guillermo Escobar with the promised money, at least in part, and instructions. Emigdio Gonzalez received an initial 5 million Guaraníes advance, about $1,100, from that sum. With it, he went about acquiring the tools of the trade. A second-hand .38 caliber revolver, an unregistered motorcycle, and a pair of disposable mobile phones known in local slang as cabritos, goats, for their tendency to be sacrificed after use. The conspirators plotted meticulously over the phone throughout July 2011. Marilyn, the mastermind, supplied insider information on her sister's habits and schedule, what time Evelyn left home in the morning, where she went during the day, and crucially, when she typically returned home each evening. They settled on an ambush at Evelyn's residence, figuring that would be the easiest place to catch her off guard. All the while, Marilyn maintained a facade of normalcy with her family. In late July, she even attended a birthday gathering with Evelyn and other relatives, smiling in photographs and making small talk. No one suspected that behind the scenes, she was coordinating her younger sister's assassination. By early August 2011, all the pieces were in place. On August 2nd, Emigdio Gonzalez took a leave from his police duties and armed himself with the newly acquired revolver. He donned his dark police uniform jacket, possibly thinking it would deflect suspicion, or simply because it had handy concealed pockets for the weapon. That afternoon, he mounted the motorcycle and headed to Fernando de la Mora. Using one of the disposable cell phones, he kept in contact with Guillermo Escobar, who in turn was relaying updates from Marilyn. Evelyn had gone out earlier that day and was expected back around dusk. Emigdio waited near the Eberhardt family home, looping the quiet blocks on his bike. According to the later investigation, around 5:50 p.m., Evelyn's car was spotted approaching. Emigdio took up his position. Moments later, Emigdio executed the plan with cold precision. He drove up to Evelyn's car window just as she paused at her gate, fired the fatal shot to her head, and sped away. He left behind 2 traumatized children and a community in chaos. Marilyn's deadly wish had been fulfilled. Her own sister lay dead. But not everything went according to Marilyn's script. She had instructed that the murder should look like a robbery. Perhaps the idea was that the killer would steal Evelyn's handbag to mislead investigators. However, Emigdio Gonzalez made no attempt to grab any belongings. Whether it was oversight or he simply didn't care, the crime scene did not resemble a botched theft at all. As Marilyn herself would later complain, it ended up looking like an execution. This slip would become a point of contention among the conspirators. Evelyn's murder immediately drew the attention of Paraguay's top homicide detectives. Within hours, a special team from the National Police was on the case, led by officers experienced in contract killing investigations. The circumstantial evidence, a single clean shot, nothing stolen, a getaway vehicle, strongly suggested a hired hit. Investigators quietly began looking closer to home, suspecting that someone in Evelyn's circle had a motive to have her killed. Very soon, suspicion fell on the family dynamics. Police learned of the bad blood between the sisters over Jorge Centurion. They learned that Marilyn had recently shown unusual interest in Evelyn's schedule. One detail particularly raised eyebrows. At the time of the murder, Marilyn had been nowhere to be found, which was odd since she often visited their mother's home, where Evelyn also lived, around that hour. Instead, Marilyn only arrived on the scene later, after hearing of the tragedy, and some officers noted that her reaction struck them as strangely muted. Still, there was no hard evidence against anyone in the family, and police had to proceed carefully. A breakthrough came when detectives traced phone records around the time of the murder. Call logs showed a flurry of calls between Marilyn, Guillermo Escobar, and an unknown number on August 2nd and August 3rd, 2011. That unknown number, it turned out, belonged to the disposable phone used by Emigdio Gonzalez. By mid-August, investigators had enough reason to bring Guillermo Escobar in for questioning. He had been spotted by neighbors hanging around the Eberhardt home at odd times, likely scouting with Emigdio, and his connection to Marilyn made him a person of interest. On September 13th, 2011, 6 weeks after the murder, police moved in. Guillermo Escobar Cortázar was arrested in Fernando de la Mora. He was 25, barely older than the victim. Under interrogation, confronted with the call records and perhaps fearing the weight of a murder charge on his own back, Guillermo Escobar broke down and confessed. What he revealed was a story so shocking that, at first, the seasoned detectives could barely believe it. Escobar not only admitted to participating in the plot, he placed the blame squarely on Evelyn's own sister. He told police that Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt was the mastermind who had ordered the hit on her younger sister. He detailed how Marilyn had recruited him, how he in turn had recruited his friend, Officer Emigdio Gonzalez, to be the triggerman. Escobar recounted the planning, the payment, every step up to the moment of the killing. In his confession, Guillermo even revealed the post-murder dispute that had unfolded. On the day after the killing, August 3rd, Emigdio, the hitman, was furious that Marilyn was refusing to pay the remaining money. He had done the job, Emigdio argued, so he wanted his 35 million Guaranese balance immediately. Marilyn's chilling response, according to Guillermo, was that she wouldn't pay because he'd done the job badly. It was obviously a hit, not the fake robbery she had intended. The two men, Escobar and Gonzalez, had then exchanged threats. Emigdio threatened to expose Guillermo or even harm him if he didn't get paid. Panicked, Guillermo pleaded with Marilyn that they had to pay to keep Emigdio quiet. Marilyn relented. In a grotesque twist during Evelyn's wake, While family and friends mourned beside her coffin, Marilyn quietly handed Guillermo the remaining bundle of cash. Guillermo then slipped away from the wake to deliver the blood money to Emigdio Gonzalez. This detail in particular horrified everyone who later heard it. Marilyn had literally paid off her sister's killer in the middle of her sister's funeral. It was a portrait of cold-blooded calculation, almost beyond comprehension. With Escobar's confession in hand, authorities acted swiftly. They arrested Officer Emigdio Gonzalez soon thereafter. Emigdio, confronted with evidence and Escobar's statements, eventually admitted his role as the gunman. And finally, on September 16, 2011, police moved to arrest Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt. The mastermind sister had insisted on her innocence when rumors began swirling, but now the law came for her. Marilyn was charged with intentional homicide as the instigator of the crime, the one who had set it all in motion. As she was led away in handcuffs, journalists captured images of the 33-year-old, head bowed and face stony. Paraguay's public watched, astonished, as it sunk in that a sister was accused of brutally betraying her own flesh and blood. The case immediately became a media sensation. Headlines blared with variations of, "She ordered her sister killed out of jealousy." The Eberhardt sisters were compared to Cain and Abel, their story labelled the curse of Cain and Abel in modern times. The public was mesmerised and appalled in equal measure. Talk radio shows dissected Marilyn's possible motives. Was it a crime of passion? Greed? Insanity? Psychologists were interviewed in magazines, discussing how envy can fester within a family. The betrayal was nearly incomprehensible. A sister hiring a hitman to kill her sister, all for the love of a man, as one paper put it bluntly. Evelyn's family was shattered. Frida Eberhardt, Evelyn and Marilyn's mother, had now effectively lost both daughters, one to murder, the other to prison. In an unusual move under Paraguayan law, Frida Eberhardt herself joined the criminal case as a co-plaintiff against her surviving daughter. This meant that the grieving mother actively participated in the prosecution, alongside the state, to seek justice for Evelyn. It was a dramatic stance. A mother determined to see her elder daughter punished for the death of her younger one. Frida later said she did it because, "I want justice for my daughter." There was an outpouring of public sympathy for the mother who had to carry this unimaginable burden. Marilyn Eberhardt, meanwhile, adamantly denied any involvement in her sister's death. Despite Escobar's detailed confession and the phone evidence, Marilyn proclaimed her innocence to anyone who would listen. In prison awaiting trial, she was described as eerily calm. Psychological evaluations conducted on Marilyn found no signs of mental disorder or impairment. In fact, a court-appointed psychologist reported, somewhat astonished, that Marilyn did not feel any anguish about her situation and was not depressed despite being behind bars. These were emotions one would normally expect from someone facing life in prison, yet Marilyn seemed almost unfazed. The lack of remorse or anxiety was noted by the family's lawyer, who argued it demonstrated Marilyn's cold-blooded, calculated nature. Marilyn's own attorneys floated various theories in her defense, that Escobar was lying to save himself, or that perhaps Jorge Centurion, the ex-husband, had orchestrated something out of sight. But there was scant evidence for any alternative suspect. In March 2015, after years of pre-trial proceedings and delays, the case finally went to trial in Asunción. Paraguay's justice system does not use juries for serious crimes. Instead, a 3-judge Tribunal de Sentencia heard the evidence and would render the verdict. The trial was held in an open courtroom, and it garnered intense media coverage. Journalists packed the room. Every development was reported on evening news and in next-day papers. Marilyn Eberhardt sat at the defense table, often expressionless, occasionally jotting notes. Across the aisle sat her mother Frida with prosecutors, a picture of quiet determination and sorrow. Over the course of the trial, the full story of Evelyn's murder was laid bare. Witness after witness recounted the tale of jealousy and betrayal that led to the crime. The judges heard from phone experts about the communication between the accused. Ballistic experts testified that the bullet retrieved from Evelyn's body matched the revolver found in Emigdio Gonzalez's possession, Emigdio had been arrested with the presumed murder weapon, according to police reports. Perhaps most damning of all, Guillermo Escobar took the stand. Facing the judges directly, he repeated under oath all that he had first confessed years prior. At one point, an observer recalled, Marilyn finally showed emotion. As Escobar described the funeral payment incident, Marilyn's face twisted and she covered her eyes. Whether in shame or frustration, it was hard to tell. A photographer captured that moment. Marilyn hunched over, hands pressed against her forehead, as if the weight of her deeds had finally crashed down upon her. The trial also highlighted Marilyn's motive. Prosecutors presented evidence that Marilyn knew of the affair between Evelyn and Jorge, and this knowledge had driven her over the edge. Jealousy, rivalry, and money made Marilyn decide to hire a hitman to murder her sister, one prosecutor summarized, echoing the testimony of witnesses. On the defense side, Marilyn's lawyers tried to poke holes in Escobar's story. They suggested he might have acted alone or with Emigdio for personal reasons, and was falsely implicating Marilyn as revenge for some past grievance. But there was no evidence that Escobar had any motive to kill Evelyn on his own. No personal connection, no gain, nothing. The simplest, most straightforward explanation was the one Escobar himself gave. He did it because his boss, Marilyn, asked him to and paid him. After several days of hearings, the three-judge panel rendered its verdict on March 26, 2015. Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt was found guilty of being the instigator of the homicide of her sister. The judges then pronounced Emigdio Gonzalez guilty as the material author, the triggerman who had physically carried out the murder, and Guillermo Escobar Cortázar guilty as a necessary accomplice, the intermediary who made the deadly connection. Paraguay's penal code allows severe sentences for such crimes, and the prosecution had earlier asked the court to impose the maximum 30 years for both Marilyn and Emigdio, given the heinous and calculated nature of the fratricide. They requested a lesser but still substantial sentence for Escobar, who, after all, had cooperated and confessed. The judges, taking into account various factors, handed down the following sentences: 24 years in prison for Emigdio Gonzalez, the hired killer, 22 years for Marilyn Eberhardt, the betrayed sister turned mastermind, and 18 years for Guillermo Escobar, the facilitator who had turned state's witness. Marilyn's face went pale as she heard 22 years. For the first time, her composure cracked. She began to sob, burying her face in her hands as the courtroom buzzed. It would be comforting to think the story ended there, with justice served. But the legal saga of the Eberhardt case was far from over. Paraguay's justice system allows for multiple layers of appeal, and Marilyn was not prepared to spend 22 years quietly. Her defense team immediately filed appeals, arguing that the trial had been unfair. The case went to a higher court, and in October 2015, the Court of Appeals affirmed the convictions, finding no glaring issues. However, Marilyn's lawyers persisted and eventually took the fight to Paraguay's Supreme Court. Years passed as the appeals wound through the system. During this time, Marilyn remained in prison. Emigdio and Escobar were also behind bars. Marilyn even managed to start a Facebook page from prison titled "I Am Innocent," where she posted lengthy letters protesting her conviction. In one 2021 post, Marilyn wrote, "I have spent 11 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Dead in life in a place no one could ever imagine. Now I have hope that judges will deliver a fair evaluation of the evidence." She insisted that the murderer is free. A claim that puzzled many, since the two men who literally killed Evelyn, Emigdio and Guillermo, were very much incarcerated. If Marilyn was implying someone else was responsible, or she was referring to some technicality, it was never quite clear. Her assertions of innocence won little public sympathy given the weight of evidence, but they kept the case in the conversation. Then, in April 2021, a dramatic twist. The penal chamber of Paraguay's Supreme Court annulled the entire 2015 judgment. In a 2-1 decision, the Supreme Court found that procedural errors had tainted the original trial. Specifically, the justices ruled that Guillermo Escobar's initial police confession, the statement he gave to detectives implicating Marilyn, had been improperly used as evidence at trial. Paraguayan law requires that a co-defendant's out-of-court statement cannot be used to convict another defendant unless it is repeated and scrutinized under oath in court. In the 2015 trial, Escobar did testify, but apparently the written record of his police confession had also been introduced, which the Supreme Court viewed as a violation of Marilyn's due process rights. Therefore, the convictions of Marilyn, Emigdio, and Escobar were all vacated. The Supreme Court ordered a new trial for all three. This development caused an uproar. Marilyn's family was distraught. Would she go free, despite everything? Legal experts noted that an annulment isn't an acquittal. It means, do the trial over correctly. Still, Marilyn's defense rejoiced at a second chance. It took until late 2022 for the retrial to actually occur, delayed by backlogs and the pandemic disruptions. Meanwhile, Marilyn, Emigdio, and Escobar remained in custody pending the new trial, because the evidence of their involvement was still deemed strong. Marilyn's lawyers tried at various points to secure her release due to the long pre-trial detention. They argued that she had been behind bars far beyond the legal limit for someone without a finalized sentence. Paraguayan law generally caps preventive detention at 5 years for serious crimes. In August 2024, as the case dragged on, the Supreme Court, a different chamber, considered a habeas corpus request by Marilyn's lawyers complaining that her continued detention was illegal given the protracted process. However, the court rejected the petition, essentially ruling that the exceptional circumstances, multiple annulments and retrials, justified her continued incarceration for the time being. Finally, the second trial took place in November 2022 in Asunción, more than 11 years after the murder. It was unusual to retry a case so long after the fact, but prosecutors essentially presented the same case. After deliberations, in late November 2022, the second tribunal returned the same verdict, guilty for all three defendants. This time, their sentences were slightly reduced, perhaps reflecting the years already served or a reappraisal of their culpability. Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt was sentenced to 20 years in prison, down from 22. Emigdio Gonzalez received 22 years, down from 24. Guillermo Escobar got 16 years, down from 18. The prosecution had again pushed for the maximum 30-year terms for Marilyn and Emigdio, emphasizing the egregious betrayal involved. But the judges exercised some leniency, possibly influenced by the fact that by 2022, the defendants had already spent over a decade locked up. Marilyn naturally appealed yet again. Incredibly, the second verdict was also nullified on appeal, continuing the judicial odyssey. Details of that second annulment were not widely reported, but it appears an appellate court found another procedural issue with the 2022 trial. Thus, a third trial had to be scheduled. This third trial took place in August-September 2024, again in a courtroom in the capital. It had been 13 years since the murder of Evelyn. The trial, presided over by a fresh panel of judges, was essentially a replay. On September 13, 2024, the verdict was delivered. For the third time, Marilyn Eberhardt was found guilty, as were Emigdio Gonzalez and Guillermo Escobar. The judges, perhaps weary of the long process and noting the defendants' long time served, issued significantly reduced sentences this time. Marilyn was sentenced to 15 years in prison, Emigdio also to 15 years, Escobar to 13 years. In practical terms, these sentences meant that Guillermo Escobar walked free immediately. He had already spent 13 years in custody since 2011, so his new 13-year term was equivalent to time served. Marilyn and Emigdio, each with 15-year terms, had also served about 13 years by then. Paraguayan law allows inmates to seek parole after serving a substantial portion of their sentence, especially if only a couple of years remain. It was a striking contrast. The first trial had envisioned Marilyn locked up until well into her 50s, but now she would potentially regain freedom in her late 40s. However, prosecutors pointed out that Marilyn had effectively been punished. She did spend over 13 years in prison, a significant penalty by any measure. For the Eberhardt family, the years of turmoil had taken their toll. Frida Eberhardt, now in her late 60s, was exhausted but thankful that her quest to hold Marilyn accountable succeeded in the end. She said after the final verdict that while no sentence could bring Evelyn back, at least the record shows who was responsible. Marilyn Michelle Eberhardt today remains behind bars in 2025, though likely not for much longer. By late 2025, she is around 47 years old and has the prospect of release on the horizon. Sources close to the prison say she has kept a low profile, perhaps resigned to her fate. Emigdio Gonzalez is similarly nearing release. In interviews shortly after the 2024 verdict, one of her lawyers maintained that Marilyn was considering a final appeal to an international human rights court, claiming she was wrongfully convicted. But such an effort, if it happens, is expected to be futile. Paraguay's own courts have spoken clearly. Evelyn's little daughter, who witnessed the murder, was raised by her grandmother, Frida. By now that girl is a teenager. One can only imagine the trauma she carries, having seen what she saw, and later learning that her own aunt was behind it all. The family did their best to shield her from the public eye as she grew up. As for Jorge Centurion, the man whose involvement unwittingly sparked the tragedy, he reportedly cooperated with authorities during the investigation, and then faded from public view. Some say he moved abroad, unable to face the ghosts of the past in Paraguay. In a final act of closure, when the third verdict was delivered in 2024, Frida Eberhardt once again spoke briefly. She stood outside the courthouse, clutching a photo of Evelyn, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, forever 23. Frida, voice trembling but resolute, said to a cluster of microphones, "A painful chapter closes. Now Evelyn can rest in peace." Thanks again for listening, and thank you so much for all the great reviews. If you enjoy hearing true crime cases that are rarely covered in English, please consider subscribing. It really helps the show grow and lets us keep bringing you stories you won't find anywhere else.